All right, welcome back to the Fighter Pilot Professor. I am your host, Meta. Glad you're here. Today we're going to be talking about the Wright Brothers and innovating and becoming the burden to innovation, all in one episode. It's going to be great. We'll dive right in. As always, hit that like button, follow me on Instagram and YouTube, Fighter Pilot Professor, and then you can get this podcast wherever you get your podcast. Like it, share it with your friends, drive that algorithm so we can find us easier. Here we go. Welcome to the Fighter Pilot Professor podcast. I'm your host, Meta. And in the Fighter Pilot Professor podcast, every week we examine world events and your daily life through the mind of a fighter pilot. The episodes answer your questions, harnessing my experience in 25 years of flying fighter jets and my PhD in history, policy, and strategy. You can tune in wherever you find your favorite podcast. You can follow me on Instagram and on YouTube, the Fighter Pilot Professor. So, here we are, more than 120 years later. December 17th, 1903, the Wright brothers, Orville and Wilbur Wright, took the first heavier-than-air flight in history. Right? It was a whopping 120-foot flight, lasted just a few seconds, about 12 seconds. And, it seems underwhelming, but of course it launched my favorite thing, which is airplanes. People had flown in balloons and whatnot before, but this was the first time that humans had flown in a powered aircraft that was heavier than air. Took off on its own power, flew under control, and then landed. It kind of crashed at the end, but then landed. That day, the Wright brothers went on to fly 4 flights total. The last one, they broke the airplane a little bit, and then they went back to Dayton, Ohio, and really, really learned to fly. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about how they came about doing this. And if you don't know, and you probably do, but if you're not a super airplane nerd like I am, you may not. The Wright brothers, of course, were bicycle mechanics, and they owned a bicycle shop in Dayton, Ohio. And they were just kind of tinkerers by choice and by trade, and curious people. Also, allegedly, they were quite competitive with each other and often argued and fought very intensely over some of the ideas that they had. And interestingly, at some point, they became interested in flight. And they were both sort of engineering minds, and they spent a lot of time researching the subject of flight. And they took several trips before 1903 down to Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, and they experimented with gliders and kites and different types of other things like that to help them learn about flight. And I think this is the most interesting part about the Wright brothers learning to fly, was that during their experimentation and during their research, what they found was the leading knowledge on aerodynamics at the time did not match the data that they were collecting as they were doing their experiments. The numbers didn't line up, as it were. Aircraft didn't perform like they were supposed to perform, these glider aircrafts and kind of kites they were using. Propellers didn't work the way they were supposed to work. There was just a lot of math that wasn't mathin', as it were, right? And so they had the audacity as not trained engineers. These were bicycle repairmen, mostly, just from the small town, quote, of Dayton, Ohio, that owned this little bicycle shop. And they had the audacity to doubt the world's leading experts in aerodynamics. And so they built their own wind tunnels, actually. They built several of them. And they tested their hypothesis that, hey, man, there is something wrong with the math of the modern aerodynamic theory, at least at the time, the modern aerodynamic theory. And they tested different wing shapes. They put different types of materials into their wind tunnels. They tested different propeller sizes at different speeds, and they went through a whole set of experiments. And sure enough, they found that the math was not correct. The current expert theory on aerodynamics was downright wrong. In fact, it was so wrong that one of their competitors at the time, Samuel Langley, who has an Air Force base famously named after him, and who was one of the heads of the Smithsonian Institute and had this massive backing from the U.S. government, and was one of the world's foremost leading experts in flight at the time, failed in his experiments on the Potomac River outside of D.C. on multiple occasions, and failed miserably. In fact, did so in front of the press in very dramatic fashion. And the main reason why he failed is because he was using data that was wrong. And the Wright brothers had the sort of gumption, right, to go out and innovate and question the reality and say, hey, is this right? This doesn't seem right. What if we did this? What if we did that? And so that, I think, was the main reason why the Wright brothers succeeded, is they were willing to sort of question the reality of what was happening and examine it from all aspects, right? And they examined, how do the airplanes work? What do wings look like? How do we control them in flight? Where do we put the pilot? How do we balance the airplane? Everything, right? They questioned everything about how airplanes worked, and they tested their theories over and over and over again, and eventually, Shazam, they are the ones that win the race. They are the ones that go out and beat the man, right? The people with the government funding, the foremost leading experts, they're the ones that do it, right? These bicycle repairmen, tinkerers, sort of dreamer guys from the small town of Dayton, Ohio, that go out and do this, right? Dayton, Ohio is not really that small of a town, but you get what I'm saying. At any rate, and then, right, they become the foremost leading experts in flying after that. But here's where the story kind of takes an unfortunate turn, in my opinion. So in their quest to become the first airmen, as it were, they do all of this doubting of the system, right? But once they've crossed through, they become super protective of their baby, and rightly so, right? They put a lot of time, money, and effort into learning how to fly, right? And one of the reasons why, and you just imagine, at least I did until I kind of read more about the Wright brothers. You just imagine, they learned to fly, and then everybody knew about it, and boom, what do you know? Flying is flying, and boom, we have flying, right? And that's just the way it is. That's not actually the case at all. They're doing these tests in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, which is pretty remote. Even nowadays, it's pretty remote, hard to get to, but certainly back in 1903, it was really remote. Not a lot of stuff going on out there, not really any people covering them in the press. It's really not well known that they do this, right? And they go back to Dayton, and they actually keep experimenting and keep progressing, right, and learning more and developing new ways to control the aircraft, to power the aircraft, et cetera, right? And so in 1903 and 1904 and 1905, they're going through these steps of learning it, and not a whole lot of people know. This becomes more and more common knowledge, but the Wright brothers are super protective of their airplane and all the technology that goes into it. Again, for some good reasons, right? And then eventually the United States government buys in, and they get a contract with the Wright brothers and start to build Wright airplanes. And then competitors start to arrive, right? Good news, like flying airplanes, doesn't just stay hidden forever, right? It comes out. And so other people, like Glenn Curtiss, for example, start to take notice, right? People in Europe start to take notice, and the Wrights take their technology to Europe initially because they're having a hard time convincing the U.S. government that, hey, we learned to fly and we can teach you. And so they go to governments in Europe, particularly France. People in France are really fascinated by this technology. And so they take their show on the road, as it were, and sell it to European audiences. But one of the things that they do is they become really protective of a lot of the technology that they use. And they get into a lot of patent battles over a myriad of things with people like Glenn Curtiss and other competitors of the Wright Flyer. So much so that it actually, in my opinion, impedes American aerial progress sort of between the 1908, 1906 timeframe, we'll say, up until the middle of, well, actually the end of World War I. The U.S., by the time World War I is over, is effectively not an air country. It's not an air country at all. Despite being the birth of aviation, the U.S. is well behind in aviation technology when World War I breaks out, and that the United States remains behind throughout this whole span of the war. And it's not until after the war, frankly, until after 1920, that the idea of America as an air nation really becomes a thing. It's World War I that helps do that. And it's sadly, it's not the Wright brothers, although they are integral in some of this story. It's not the Wright brothers that are the primary driver of this aerial innovation. In fact, because they're so protective and secretive of the technology that develop, they actually become a hindrance, in my opinion, to the birth of aviation in the United States, which I think is so ironic and sad, in my opinion. So what are the lessons that we take out of the story of the Wright brothers, right? Is that, one day you can be the innovator and the next day you can be the roadblock, right? And it happens to companies all the time. It happens to leaders, right? You go from rebel to the man sort of overnight, as it were, right? And you really lose your sense of innovation. And I think there's a ton of reasons why that happens. Some of them are really good, right? You become worried about what it is that puts food on your table, and you're like, man, I got to protect this thing that pays me, right? And so, hey, I don't want to give that up. And I think that's the case with the Wright brothers, is they recognize like this becomes their livelihood, and if they give it up to everybody, then who are they, and how can they have any say in what goes on, and how are they going to put food on the table? I think that's part of it, right? Some of it is, in my opinion, you become a little bit like the foremost experts in aerodynamics before the Wright brothers broke the molds. You just assume that you're right? You were the one that created this thing. You must be right, and you never doubt or question your assumptions. Which, again, right, following the story of the Wright brothers is, like, they do all this innovation, and one of the things that they don't do is really learn how to fly an airplane more efficiently. And one of the reasons why is because the technology they're using wooden wings with fabric, which is common in the time, but they're using wing warping technology. They're literally bending the wings to make the airplanes turn. Well, others, like Glenn Curtiss and other aviation pioneers, put different control surfaces on the wings, and so instead of trying to bend the whole wing, they're just moving one piece of the wing, and that makes the airplane actually lighter and stronger in a lot of ways, and so you can make it go faster and do a lot of things. And so the Wright's technology actually is wrong. So they build all this great technology, and then they stick to their guns assuming that their assumptions are right, and turns out not so much, right? So these guys who were the ones questioning the assumptions become the sort of impediment and the thing to be doubted. And I think that happens all the time. As we make these decisions, we achieve these things, we assume that we have made the right choices and everything is going to be perfect, and boom, here we are, right? And in the meantime, we're standing still. And I know that I've talked about this before, is that, like, dude, if you're not moving forward, you're actually falling behind. And that's the unfortunateness of success, is that, like, there is no such thing as standing still, right? The Wright brothers are, in my opinion, like exemplar of this, and there are plenty of others, right? But you have to keep innovating. You have to keep asking those questions. You have to be 1902 Wright brothers, not 1906 Wright brothers, right? Where you're asking the questions, you're challenging the assumptions, you're moving forward, you're finding a way to advance and achieve the dream that you're trying to achieve, and you're not just sort of stuck in your ways, assuming that you are correct and you are the one that is right? So I hope that you find this little tale of the Wright brothers. I respect and admire the Wright brothers and all of the things they do. Don't get me wrong, right? This is not a teardown of the Wright brothers, but it's really just a way of telling a story, I think, that is interesting to how a lot of humans act, right? Especially when we become successful. So Put that in your pocket for what it's worth, and continue to question those assumptions. Are my assumptions in life right? What can I learn? Famously, I've heard people say that if I still think the same way now that I did 20 years ago, then I haven't succeeded. And I would offer this is kind of the problem that the Wright brothers face. So challenge those assumptions, challenge your own assumptions, always be questioning and looking out for how you can improve. As always, follow me, listen on Instagram, on YouTube, on Apple Podcast, on Spotify, wherever you get your podcast. The Fighter Pilot Professor. Hit that like button, share it with your friends, drive that algorithm so we can keep sharing the good news. And we got a special episode coming up I think you'll really like for the next one. Have a good one.